have the honor to present the author of this book and also the person who has made a very important and is making a very important contribution to the discussion on international world affairs. Her name is Radhika Desai. She's professor at the Department of Political Studies at the University of Manitoba. She's director of the Geopolitical Economic Research Group at that university in Canada. She is the convener of the International Manifesto Group. Her books include Capitalism, Coronavirus and War, a Geopolitical Economy, the one that we're presenting today, as well as the Slouching towards Ayodhya, from Congress to Hindutva in Indian politics, published the second revised version in 2004, and Intellectuals and Socialism, Social Democrats and the Labour Party, published in 1994, and also a New Statesman and Society Book of the Month. I would just like to add one other point with regards to the work of Professor Desai, and as the International Manifesto Group, which she convenes, has held, I don't know how many webinars in the last couple of years. I mean, we're talking about dozens of webinars on all the important issues facing the society. We had, for example, one on the truckers' convoy, also in Latin America, Venezuela, Cuba, West Asia, Iran, South Africa, you name it, political thinking, etc. And so this is a very important task, and this book is part of her overall contribution in order to develop discussion on all the issues facing us today. Radhika.
All right. So first of all, let me say thank you very much to everyone who is here. I'm really honored to be at this first Canadian hybrid book launch, and I would like to thank Arnold August for organizing it here in Montreal. Thanks also to Arnold, William, Jenny Lohr, and Claude for taking the time to speak here today and reflecting on what I have to say in the book. To Norma Raymond, who of course gave such a wonderful performance just now, and to the interpreters, the translators, and also to Owen and Sean for helping organize here, to Brendan to helping organize it in Winnipeg, and to Alan and Paul who are behind the scenes organizing the Zoom and the live stream, where also lots of people are watching. So it's really great. And finally, thanks to the Centre Saint-Pierre for hosting it. I'd also like to thank our Ukrainian friends, at least they say they're Ukrainian. They're also very welcome. I think we are speaking here in the name of humanity, in the name of peace, and in the name of socialism, which includes everybody. So in my brief time today, what I'd like to do is say a few words about how I came to write this book, and then run through some of the main arguments. From the start, my perspective, so this book was occasioned by the pandemic, and my perspective was distinctive. The question I had was not about the origins of the pandemic or the public health measures or anything. My question was what should have been a public health emergency, a serious public health emergency, turned into such a knockdown crisis of capitalism, leading to financial markets of every type falling like stones, central banks engaging in the greatest scope and scale of rescue operations that had ever been witnessed, and economies facing stoppages of the most unprecedented sort. So in the middle of March 2020, just after the WHO declared a public health emergency a pandemic, I wrote a column for Canadian Dimension reflecting this preoccupation. The reason I was able to do this is because I had been developing a critique of capitalism at the world level for several decades. And already then, in mid-March 2020, I could see that the pandemic was telling on capitalism in both senses of the term, exposing its weaknesses and dirty secrets, and also weakening it further, in that sense, telling on it in both sense. In my column, I was also building on the work that I had done on what I call geopolitical economy, a new approach to international affairs that I had put forward in my 2013 book, Geopolitical Economy After US Hegemony, Globalization and Empire. And that book made three arguments. First of all, it argued that thanks to the contradictions of capitalism, states had always been critically involved in managing capitalist economies. Secondly, as a result of this, on the international plane, relations between what Marx called producing nations, that is to say what we call international relations, were governed by the logic of imperialism, which arose directly out of the contradictions of capitalism, making the major capitalist economies expansionist and imperialist, and the resistance to that imperialism. So this became a sort of dialectic between imperialism and anti-imperialism that Trotsky had once dubbed uneven and combined development. This meant that the historical evolution of the capitalist world could not be adequately understood by notions of globalization, which envisaged merely the spreading of markets and capitalism around the world, nor could it be understood in terms of a succession of hegemonies, UK hegemony followed by US hegemony, etc., etc. Indeed, geopolitical economy argued that there was no such thing as US hegemony. So instead of these ways of understanding, the way to understand the world economy was in terms of the unfolding of the dialectic of imperialism and anti-imperialism, in which in history so far, the latter has prevailed. Anti-imperialism has had the upper hand, leading to ever widening multipolarity, or what, following Hugo Chavez, I also, after having written Geopolitical Economy, I also began calling pluripolarity. That is to say, we have lived through a very long-term, not very fast, but a very long-term decline in the strength of imperialism. The third argument that geopolitical economy made was that as a consequence of this globalization, US hegemony, free trade, all of these, which pose as theories of the world order, are not at all theories, but rather ideologies. And as ideologies, they serve the interests of dominant countries, by trying to portray the world economy as a seamless whole in which national economies and nation states don't matter. And the reason they do that, the purpose in doing this, is precisely to pry open the economies of the rest of the world so that they may serve to help imperialist countries manage their contradictions, the contradictions of their capitalism, by forcing them to be outlets for their excess commodities and excess capital, and also sources of cheap labor and cheap raw materials. So this book was published in 2013, and since then, I would say that in the decades since then, capitalism's decline and the spread of multipolarity has become much clearer. When I wrote this book, hardly anybody talked about multipolarity, but now a lot of people do. So, and of course, at the same time, the decline of the capitalist world has become more manifest, and this is most manifest in the focus of capitalism, coronavirus, and war, namely the countries that have been, that are the most neoliberal and financialized countries of the capitalist world. That is where we see the contradictions in their fullest form. So capitalism, coronavirus, and war, which, by the way, I should say is available free. I have brought some copies here, but I don't necessarily, you don't have to buy it. You only have to buy it if you want a hard copy. The PDF is free. And I brought some copies to sell at a discount, which is still too pricey in my humble opinion, but there's nothing I can do about it. But anyway, so this book has already been downloaded about 10,000 times. And so in this book, I began writing it as merely coronavirus and capitalism. And I was going to talk about the whole question of what the pandemic had done to capitalism. But I was late in submitting the manuscript. And by early 2022, we witnessed the launch of the proxy war against Russia, led by the United States, in which Ukraine is simply the tool. And if our Ukrainian friends had actually stayed and listened without disruption, I would have tried to persuade them that exactly those people who are saying stand up for Ukraine, exactly those people who are saying we are for Ukraine are party to the destruction of that country. Had they not been party to it, had they allowed the Minsk agreements to be implemented, Ukraine would still exist in a way that it never will anymore. I don't think, I'm afraid. Okay, I therefore when the proxy war started, I essentially realized that it had to do with exactly the same problems of capitalism that I was already discussing in relation to the pandemic. So I felt that I had to roll a narrative of the war, which I had, by the way, been following and talking about all the way through. So I decided to do that, and therefore it became Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War. So what does this book argue? And I'm just going to now take you through step by step the main argument. So first of all, it argues that the current NATO war on Russia is a result of a decaying neoliberal financialized capitalism, complete with its declining imperial system, cadaverously clinging on to its fast ebbing life. And I'd like to discuss, if you want to discuss this, but I'm very serious, capitalism is past its sell-by date. Secondly, the war's counterproductive results, the unraveling of US influence in various parts of the world, the challenge to dollar dominance, etc., all further underline the dwindling options of imperialism, which of course makes imperialism that much more desperate and violent, but that's another matter altogether. Thirdly, as the geopolitical economy approach has long argued, while actually existing socialism was always the leading edge of anti-imperialism, of opposition to the system. Today, more and more countries, no matter the political character of their governments, are no longer willing or able to subordinate themselves to imperialism. Further, the pandemic told on capitalism, like I said, in both senses of the term. It exposed capitalism's dirty secrets, its inequality, its productive decay, its gross racism and misogyny, and exacerbated its already mounting difficulties. What should have been a mere public health crisis turned into a knockdown crisis pervading economy, society, finance, culture, and politics. As the US and the UK, the leading neoliberal financialized capitalism showed, and this is, by the way, the only form capitalism can take if it is to avoid the danger of socialism. So these two countries in particular performed disastrously in the pandemic context. And the socialist countries led by China, by contrast, performed spectacularly well. After 4 decades of determinedly neoliberal policies, which were supposed to revive capitalism, this outcome, that is to say, the debility of capitalism, shows that capitalism is past its use-by date. Indeed, it has passed it several decades ago, indeed a century ago, when it entered the monopoly phase, much as Marx anticipated. The monopoly phase, thanks to the dialectic of uneven and combined development, developed most fully in the late 19th century challengers to British world dominance, challengers such as Germany and the United States. And this, by the way, was already noted by analysts of the system at the time, like Hilferding and Bukharin. British dominance had been founded on capitalism's competitive phase. The monopoly phase represented the culmination of capitalism's ability to develop the forces of production brutally and chaotically as it had done. They would now be developed only through planning, whether that planning takes place in the context of giant privately owned corporations or in the context of socialist states. However, capitalism has continued to exist in good part because of the weakness of the left. And there are many dimensions to this weakness, but one that I particularly emphasize is that very early in its history, the Western left squandered its potential role in preventing this outcome, that is to say, the longevity of capitalism, by turning away from Marx and adopting what Bukharin called a policy of theoretical reconciliation with its theoretical antithesis and political antagonist, namely neoclassical economics. This has blinded even the Marxist left, the Western Marxist left, to the reality of imperialism, rendering them incapable of understanding the main dynamic of international relations in the capitalist world, what Marx called the relations of producing nations. As a result, they became directly implicated in the turn towards the guns and butter reformism, that is to say, a pact between reformist leaderships of the working class and their ruling classes, saying, provided you give us a little reforms, we will allow you to engage in imperialism abroad. So this guns and butter agreements became the norm across the advanced industrialized countries. And of course, European social democracy became deeply complicit in the outbreak of the Great War. Within a decade of the publication of the greatest works on the relations of producing nations, and here I'm thinking of the writings of Luxemburg, Lenin, Bukharin, and other such people who analyzed the capitalist system of that time. Within a decade of these classical Marxist works on imperialism, thanks to the policy of theoretical reconciliation, Western Marxism, in an act of intellectual self-mutilation, faithfully disabled its understanding of this aspect of capitalism. With this policy of theoretical reconciliation, Western Marxism, on the one hand, rejected Marx's analysis of capitalism as contradictory value production on the spurious grounds that, number one, this Marx's analysis suffered from a transformation problem, that number two, Marx did not believe capitalism suffered from a chronic demand shortage, which is a crazy. If you read Marx, you don't see anything else. And thirdly, that he was wrong, that in the long run, there was a tendency of the rate of profit to fall. These are just three of the main points that Western Marxists who have been enamored of neoclassical economics have raised against Marxism. On the other hand, Western Marxists lionized capitalism. Now it was, in their view, no longer inherently contradictory, no longer subject to the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, which Ernest Mandel called the memento mori, or the reminder of death of capitalism. So instead of a Marxist view, they had a Schumpeterian view of capitalism. And this view, that is to say, capitalism that is able to constantly produce prosperity, develop the forces of production, facing no problems and contradictions, etc. And this conception of capitalism weakened Western Marxist ability to understand what actually existing socialisms in the Soviet Union in the past, in China today, and various other countries had achieved by building considerable prosperity without the privilege of imperialism, and indeed in the teeth of the powerful resistance of imperialism. The 30 Years' crisis of 1914 to 45 was therefore a comprehensive crisis of capitalism and the imperial world it had created. Therefore, not only did 1914 constitute the peak of imperialism, but also of capitalism. That is why eminent thinkers like Keynes and Polanyi believed at the close of that crisis that the world would turn towards building some sort of socialism. And the same diagnosis led their opponents, people like Friedrich Hayek, to fear the same outcome and try to forestall it. These hopes and fears were not dispelled by the post-war golden age, because if you think about what happened during that golden age did see communism establish itself all the way from Prague to Pyongyang, subtracting vast swathes of the world from capitalism entirely. In the developing world embarked on national autonomous development that took distinctively socialistic forms. And in the homelands of capitalism itself, there we witnessed the greatest surge in their growth, thanks not to any capitalist dynamism, but entirely because a senile monopoly capitalism was ringed around with socialistic structures, including macroeconomic management for full employment, progressive taxation, substantial state ownership, financial repression, including capital controls, industrial regulation, the recognition and enlargement of workers' rights and strong unions, and not least welfare states. So in that sense, what these people were anticipating was proved true. However, inevitably, having abandoned Marx, Western Marxists misattributed this growth to capitalism's own dynamic, and this was a radical misdiagnosis. Notwithstanding the socialistic constraints which were put on capitalism, the underlying capitalist character of the first world economies landed them in deep crisis by the 1970s. In response, their political leaders chose to roll back rather than deepen the post-war socialistic measures which had been responsible for the growth of the golden age, instead blaming these measures for the crisis. So these leaders therefore concluded that rolling back these socialistic measures was a way to revive capitalism's dynamism, productive dynamism. Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War explains why this neoliberal turn failed. Capitalism's inability to generate growth, let alone the sort of broad-based prosperity that was possible in the post-war period, became manifest. Rather than productive dynamism, capitalism could only generate unproductive, predatory, speculative financialization, a deadly combination of rising indebtedness and asset price bubbles that strangulated production, increased inequality, and provoked routine financial crisis. This type of capitalism sported not the advanced financial systems that originally developed in the countries of finance capital that Hilferding talked about. That represents a totally different relationship between finance and production than what we see today in our very, very sick capitalisms. But rather, they have inherited and enhanced the financial system of the UK, which from the 1970s onwards was also imitated by the United States, and which on which the dollar's role as world money rests, and which it produces this type of speculative and predatory type of relationship between the productive economy and finance. The resulting neoliberal financialized capitalism is the only sort of capitalism now possible. It cannot survive without crises, both of the sort that it is prone to, such as the public health crises or climate crises, both of which are internal to capitalism, in addition to the regular financial and economic crisis that it suffers. So this type of crises are endemic, but there are also now crises capitalism foments itself, such as the ongoing war. Because in order to keep going, like fascism, this type of capitalism, which lacks its own stability, can only continue in existence amid the bubbling froth and confusion of ever new crises. Ever since we turned back from the socialistic path of the post-Second World War era, we have been paying the price economically, culturally, politically, and internationally of keeping capitalism alive. This cost today includes a political system which yo-yos between neoliberalism, which includes apparently leftist solutions to the crisis, such as universal basic income or modern monetary theory, and forces even further to the right, such as Donald Trump, etc., whose rise is in good part a direct result of the left's inability to understand imperialism and therefore understand actually existing socialism. So the struggle against imperialism is hence the most important task if we are going to stop paying this price, because both imperialism keeps capitalism going in its homeland and prevents the urgent transition to socialism both inside and outside them. So I hope this has given you some idea of the content of the book. There's much else besides I can't possibly rehearse here, but I look forward to the discussion, particularly of my commentators, and then a broader discussion with everybody in the audience.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.